we're going to take a look at how to take what we learned yesterday, the knowledge, what do we do with it? And how do we use it? And that's becoming a profoundly important question. So as I promised you, we're going to take a look at DSHEA through a 1,000-year lens. And I would love your critique. And so with that, we'll get started. So let's begin about 1,000 years ago. This is a monastic garden. And in Europe, I believe this is in England. What makes this important is it's a symbolic representation of where knowledge was stored and held, where the medicinal plants were grown, and this was a cloistered environment. You had to be invited to come in for two reasons. One, to absolve your sins, and one, to heal your body. And this is the time when this idea of these two being one and the same is that bad actions or bad thoughts will create illness in the body. And that has carried a whole legacy with it. What's also important about it is the language was Latin, a language not spoken by the vast majority of people at that time. So even if they wanted to learn it, they couldn't. It wasn't accessible to them. So this knowledge and those that held it were the elites of the time, that were the physicians, they were the gardeners, and it was this way for a very long time. It was those that held knowledge and those that did not. This is where you would go if you seek help physically, and we'll see plants and botanicals be a central theme in this first part, because they were our medicines, they were our foods, they were our clothes and textiles, they were our housing. Without plants, there are no people. We went from that to a really interesting period. This is the Kew Garden in England. It is one of the great botanical gardens. This is a different kind of garden. The history of botanical gardens might surprise you. Is we go in and we see these beautiful exotic plants. These obviously don't grow in England. What does it represent? To the people and to the opponents of England, it represented the power to go anywhere in the world with their vast navy and colonize wherever they chose and to take whatever they wanted. And that building these botanical gardens during this period of time was considered to be a way of showing your opponents your aircraft carrier fleets. And don't mess with us, is basically what it said. They were used also as elements of diplomacy. It was considered to be a marvelous gift to be given an exotic plant or seeds that were highly valued, remembering it was a capital offense in many parts of the world to take germplasm, to take seeds, but there was a very vigorous trade in taking seeds and bringing them home. Just imagine. Spices, incredibly valuable. Sugar, tea, coffee, rubber, the list goes on and on. These were the commodities on which power and wealth were built. And these two were exclusive. And there was a separation of those that had and those that didn't. And it was through the medium of the plants that this happened. So the next time you go to a botanical garden, and what we see today no longer carries that very strong and very powerful visual image, but it did at this time. And if you go to most of the other countries in Europe and in Asia, you will see these magnificent gardens and what it would take to build those. And they were making a point. There's a very dark chapter in all of this. As enslaved people from West Africa were brought to the New World, they came with nothing, literally nothing. They were not dressed, and they brought nothing with them. The one thing that they very cleverly learned how to do was to braid seeds and rice into their hair. So braiding among African women, part of that tradition began during the slave trade period, and this will still be seen in West Africa and in the Caribbean to this day. That's how precious and how important it was. So when they got to the New World, those that made it, is that they would take their native seeds and their native plants and have small gardens so they could feed themselves and take care of themselves. It was their food and their medicine. Once again, we see this separation of trying to separate people from their knowledge and from the products, the plants, that they relied so heavily on. Rolling forward, now we have a new generation of people that are migrating. They're going from Europe to America. This time they're seeking religious freedom. Is that they no longer accepted that the authority would come from above through a priest or through an intermediary to you, the individual. So as we see the tremendous convolutions of the battles about religious belief, of the right to know information directly, to have it directly received, became a fundamental battle line in early European history at this time. So many decided to leave, or they were kicked out. So this represents the pilgrims that came to the New World. And once again, it's the same problem. You don't have the right to believe and express your beliefs. And they had to remove themselves physically in order to do as they wanted to do and to believe as they wanted. The theme line here is this constant dynamic of those that control and have access to the power and the means. And what becomes really important that we'll talk about shortly is the flows of information. One of the groups that came to America from Europe were the Shakers. And they're known for a number of things. They're absolutely beautiful and simple furniture, which is very collectible today. And also their extraordinary gift and skill in growing herbs. They were the first commercial herb enterprise in America in 1799. We have a direct lineage to the Shakers through Stephen Foster. You'll know Stephen Foster because of the beautiful photography that he produced, the many books that he wrote. He served as the president of the board of trustees of ABC. He and Mark were very good friends. I knew Stephen very well also. As a teenager, Stephen needed a home to live in. He was taken in by the Shakers. The Shakers were celibate, and they were brought orphans, and so their communities were composed of people that had nowhere else to go. So Stephen learned his craft of herbs, how to grow them and what they're for, taught by the Shakers directly. There are very few Shakers left today. Very, very few. But the knowledge of the Shakers remains. They were prolific writers, and they also produced what I would consider the first ODI labels in American history. And I had a couple of these, and I can't find them, and I feel terrible about it. But I think Mark can probably help me on this one. But look at some of the names. These are plants we still use today in our industry. And it began with them. My question has been for a long time, would we have these? Was it not for the Shakers? Was it not for the others that made the very hard decision to separate themselves and come to this new world and do it, be able to do what they wanted to do? All you need to do is put shakerherbs.com, and you can buy these beautiful Shaker herbs today in small handmade baskets for $4.95. And I encourage you to do that, because these will be among the most beautifully grown and produced herbs you can imagine. And I hope you do. It'll be a fun gift as well. Come Christmas, I think people will be delighted to have something like that. So now we're at a time, this is 1799, 1800, and we're seeing now the western expansion. So the east coast of the United States is now beginning to be somewhat populated. There are some small but growing cities. And the westward movement is beginning in the early 1800s. And as you get to the frontiers, the people who left the east coast of America to move into the unknown frontiers once again did it for the same reason, to do what they wanted to do, how they wanted to do it. An important name you need to know is this man, Samuel Thompson. Samuel Thompson is really considered to be the father of the modern herbal movement in this way. He completely rebelled against the physicians of the time. Physicians then mean something than they do today. But he was in constant fights with the physicians that were trying to get him arrested, tossed into jail, because they considered him a quack. His crime was preparing little seed packets and little booklets teaching housewives how to plant their own medicinal gardens. We're back to the same theme one more time. And the medical doctors did not want him doing that because it would teach women how to care for their families using medicinal herbs. And the doctor said, that's our job, not yours. And he was quite a guy, highly opinionated, and there was a constant battle. But you look at Thompsonian medicine, you will see our legacy comes through him. He was very much of the Jacksonian age of Andrew Jackson. He was very anti-government, anti-authority. Again, another theme that tends to develop over and over again. So when you get the deck, super tiny print, but let me abstract it for you. This was an NIH study that was published about Thompson. And it's a good summary of who he was. Let me read it to you. The early botanical medical movement as a reflection of life, liberty, and literacy in Jacksonian America. There's a lot of important words there. So this paper describes a popular grassroots, and I love that word grassroots, and we're going to keep talking about it, health crusade initiated by Samuel Thompson, and that's the time period he lived. A unique brand of frontier egalitarianism exemplified in Andrew Jackson. The age that bore Jackson's name was ostensibly anti-intellectual, venerating intuitive wisdom and common sense, and an embrace of nature's apothecary. It's also a look at how a popular medical cult was both heir to and promoter of functionality of a functionally literate populace. And I think that was the whole point of this paper, is that as this author was exploring, trying to understand who Samuel Thompson was selling these herbs to and teaching, this was a literate group of people. And their ability to read and understand and care for themselves was so vastly underestimated by the health professionals of the day. Samuel Thompson is a name that you need to remember and understand because he is very much one of our ancestors in our industry genealogy. From him, we get into a time period where what we now would know as the AMA, or allopathic medicine, is really beginning to take form and take shape. And there was a group of physicians of various kinds. Remember, at this time, there were all kinds of practitioners: herbalists, hydrotherapists, naturopaths, chiropractors, homeopaths, dozens and dozens of different medical occupations. And as the AMA was forming itself, it began to develop a couple of core objectives. Is how do we bring these eclectic physicians, and that's what they were called, just the eclectics. And if you'll hear that term in the literature of our industry, is they said, we would like to draw from all traditions that we think would be helpful, not just the one that you want us to practice, which would be allopathic medicine. And so these people were punished. That punishment came in the form, oh, by the way, this is a beautiful book. I highly recommend. Nature's Path by Susan Califf. This book was introduced to me by Michelle Simon at the Institute for Natural Medicine. She's a retired professor who was invited by the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians 10 years ago to come and take a look and see if she'd be interested to write a history of American naturopathy. And she came somewhat skeptical, but she attended one of their annual meetings, which I've been to several myself. She came away so curious and interested, she agreed to do it. And this book is the work product of that. And it tells you the story. One thing you learn early on is that they squabbled a lot amongst each other. Is that a familiar thing? That there were a lot of women that were in senior leadership within their medical societies, and very important women that were leading the development of naturopathic medicine. And it was also multi-ethnic, that many ethnicities were represented within this eclectic and naturopathic tradition. This is part of the reason that today we have MOU relationships with Bastyr University, really one of the fine naturopathic schools, Sonoran University, again, another fine naturopathic school, the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians, and the Institute for Natural Medicine. Within these groups resides the true genetic understanding and wisdom that I've been describing. And they're so important because they're the tip of the spear, the canary in the mine. Anytime that there's an attack on our right to speak, it starts with them. We tend to think it starts with us on the retail and consumer side. Historically, not the case. They would always go after the practitioners. And how do you do that? Is you require them to be licensed. And that's the noose around their neck. If you don't comply, we will take your license. And then you're out of business. This whole thing came to a head in 1910 with the publication of the Flexner Report. This was the earthquake that has shaken our industry, and we are still very much affected by it, even if you've never heard about this. This was an idea of the AMA. They engaged the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundations to develop a report as to how they could improve medical education in America. Dr. Flexner was commissioned to write this report. The conclusions is that it's a mess. We have many untrained, unqualified, and unprofessional people practicing medicine, and that we need to do a number of things to clean this all up. So the report was reviewed and accepted by the AMA. Then it was shopped to various states, which is where the power lay, because that's where the licensing came from. And so they got the states and the AMA organized. And so the Flexner Report essentially destroyed the practice of eclectic medicine and naturopathic medicine for the better part of 3 generations. And now this is pretty recent history we're talking about. I won't read this to you, but I really hope that you will read this, and of course you'll have this deck. But the bottom line is this: the outcomes of this Flexner Report, that medical schools become more uniform. So now we have a mono system that will teach one school of medicine and one only. And that admission standards be enacted. And guess who were the first 2 groups not to be admitted? Women and blacks. Think back on who were physicians, who were doctors in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s. Virtually all white men. And it destroyed, there were a number of black medical colleges, and it destroyed those. Virtually gone. And women essentially disappeared from the scene as well. The other thing they said was, we believe it's important to tie a medical school to a university. And the model for that was Johns Hopkins University and its medical school, which at that time was regarded as the gold standard. So what the Flexner Report did is it set up an analysis method that would clearly disqualify the majority of medical schools and professionals practicing at that time. It was built for that purpose, and it was wildly successful. Today, what do you see? Is that allopathic medicine, as we understand it, is somewhat monolithic, that virtually all medical schools are associated with a university, and we still see low representation of the black community. There's more women now in medicine, for sure, but the black community has really struggled to find their place in modern medicine. Not to beat up on the AMA, which I'm doing, I'll keep doing it, is there was a man named Morris Fishbein, and he worked for the AMA for many, many years, and he loved to write articles and publish them mostly in the New York press and magazines. And this is one of his books, of many, called Fads and Quackery in Healing. And you go through this book, and he covers it all. Vitamins are a scam, things like massage therapy, manipulation, chiropractic, homeopathy. This is all complete rubbish. So it was a continuation of the views expressed in the Flexner report that is now being expressed through a number of people, but Morris Fishbein is famous for being the guy that was the constant critic that was demonizing and ridiculing any other school of thought in medical or healing care or practice. And he was really good at it, and he did it for many years. Now, through him, he has his own genealogy of people, some of whom are well known to the industry, maybe not here, but there were a number of critics that imprinted on him. So when I entered the industry in 1980, these were the guys that were really going after us as an industry. It was the people that Morris Fishbein taught. You see a lot of his thinking in CSPI, Center for Science and the Public Interest, as just one example. And there are many others. There were publications called Quack Watch. So quackery is a word that Morris would repeat at least 20 times a day to himself and in public. He just pounded this word, quacks, and it stuck, as well as snake oil. So he had a real influence. And the reason I think this is so important is it may be that most of you have never heard this and don't know about this. And if we don't, how can we possibly understand what is coming next if we don't understand where it came from, and that there are those that are well organized to carry on the work that we would see as oppositional to our worldview and our objectives? We now get to the point where industry starts to push back. There's I've got a whole shelf full of books. And these are very typical titles that were coming out. But look at some of these names. Linus Pauling, Nobel Prize winner. These are serious people. If you don't know the name Dirk Pearson and Sandy Shaw, you really should. Pearson versus Shalala was an epic lawsuit that everyone said couldn't be won by Dirk Pearson. They did win. And it really backed down the federal government for a while, that slapped FDA and FTC and said, leave these folks alone. And it was all about freedom of speech. And that was one of the great victories early on. And today, I would imagine the majority of industry has never heard of the case Pearson v. Shalala. I see Gene nodding his head. Mark back there, a few others. Incredibly important to what's happened. The book, and the reason I'm using the literature now, is how important certain publications have been to do one specific thing, is to rally public support or public outrage. More often it was outrage that they were going for. Anybody read The Jungle? Upton Sinclair, 1906. Upton Sinclair was a socialist, and he was a workers' rights advocate. He went into the Chicago stockyards and slaughterhouses, documented the conditions, which were absolutely horrific, you can't even imagine. He wrote this book about it, and it was about the conditions of the workers, But along the way, he has to describe the actual process of slaughtering cattle and animals and the terrible food safety conditions at the time. The book was published, and it became a sensation, and the public was outraged. But it wasn't for the reason he wanted, which was to support worker rights. The public was really upset about food conditions and unsafe foods. And it came as a just shock to him because he thought it was so clear what the point of the book was. And he is later quoted as saying, "I was aiming for their minds and I hit their stomachs," which is a great quote. It's true. But what it meant was the power of this book translated into a public response that is the genesis of the first important food and drug law in the United States, passed in 1906. That is the foundational statutory basis on which food and drug law exists to this day. It was because of this book. And it was because of the public's response to this book that Congress got real busy real quick. And the USDA sent in a number of people to document or to disprove what he was writing about. They came out and basically were so shaken and said, he's right. We have to do something. So this was a case where even the government regulators said, mea culpa, this is on us. Something has to be done. I don't recommend reading this book. It is a very hard read, and it will turn your stomach. Let's roll forward to the Proxmire Amendment, 1976. And another example, and what I'm beginning to drive to is, by the way, this is Asia Sherman's fabulous article, and as Stephen said yesterday morning, it was a hell of a tough task to actually find a copy of the Proxmire Amendment. I couldn't find it. Scott Bass couldn't find it. We kept looking around, and Asia finally came up with it. And the reason was it was buried deep inside another far bigger piece of legislation, and unless you know what you're looking for, you wouldn't find it. But there it was, and this was, as we know, a profoundly important piece of legislation because FDA had proposed to cap the potency or combination of vitamins and minerals. And the public expressed its outrage. But there had to be some outward communication to get people to say, unacceptable, government does not have the right to do that. And so that was the progenitor of DSHEA, as we know it, in two ways. Is once again the example of how do you communicate the message and you get it out to a public that will rise up and do something about it. That requires a cultural environment of populism. And this takes us back to the Jacksonian period and the very beginnings of our DNA. And as Chloe said several times yesterday, is that we are fiercely independent. And that fierce independence is rooted deeply back into the culture of who we are. And whether you know it or not, you're part of that. And most of our consumers traditionally have been part of that. What I'll get to is that premise still true? Are our consumers still of that mind to pick up a rifle in defense of our products, our beliefs, our services? And that's going to be the ultimate message here. So, Asia, thank you for this tremendous article. It's a real contribution. The other piece is that as we were building DSHEA, we borrowed two key pieces out of Proxmire. Our strategy was to tell the Congress, you've already passed this. So why would you have a problem with it? Number one was the definition. Not all of it, but the key part was the last part, which makes DSHEA so exceptional. It's whatever you think will be useful to supplement your diet. This extremely broad, open-ended language. And the other part was to introduce the concept of the structure-function claim, that nutrients, I remember this is just nutrients, that affect the structure or function of the body are physiological benefits, not medical benefits, to take them out of drugs and keep them in the domain of foods because of useful effects on the structure and function of the body. That's what we see in DSHEA. We didn't make it up. We borrowed that and plunked it into DSHEA. So we can't take credit. It was Steve McNamara who was I consider the true architect of the writing of DSHEA, is the one that said, we ought to go look at Proxmire. I think there's some useful things we should use. And he was right. That's another name people need to remember. So now we roll into DSHEA itself. So what's happened is from Proxmire, it pushed FDA back for a while. But bit by bit, the agency was seeing the nascent growth of the health food industry. The 1960s was a very formative time. There were so many companies in our industry that traced their origins to the mid and late 60s, early 70s. The explosion in Utah was very much tied to that time period. We see that on the West Coast, up in Oregon and Washington. There was a very similar development as there was in Southern California. We saw this in Long Island with nutrients, vitamins principally, New Jersey. And today we also see hubs that have grown in Phoenix, Dallas, Miami, parts of Florida. But at that time is that there were very strong regions around the country of people that had kind of adopted the culture. It was a counterculture belief. Organic foods, all the language that people would use were crunchies, hippies, et cetera, et cetera. It was said in a sense of derision is that this is really kind of childish, and there's really no need for these things. And FDA agreed with that opinion. And so there was this growing encroachment of FDA becoming more and more aggressive. And they got really aggressive. And it was really around botanicals principally, but they would also go after nutrients as well. And it got so bad, there was a raid in Washington State, the famous case of Jonathan Wright. Very nice doctor. And the FDA and the DOJ came in flak jackets and guns into his office, and they put people on the floor with hands behind their heads. His alleged crime was giving B12 shots. That hit the Seattle Times, and that started once again, that public message, and outrage followed nationally. And FDA was being roundly criticized, being excoriated for this kind of bully tactics. Well, they kept doing things of that sort. They just wouldn't learn their lesson. David Kessler comes out with his Dietary Supplement Task Force report, first denies that it exists, then finally confesses, yeah, we do have a task force, and we do have a report. Could we read it, please? And when we read it, it basically said just what we thought it would say, that vitamins and minerals should be capped in potency, botanicals are drugs, most amino acids are drugs or food additives, full stop. And it was a repeat of what FDA had been saying for several decades at that point. This is late 70s, early 80s. Then we roll into 1990s. I was working at Nature's Way. My old boss, Ken Murdoch, is here. And so I left Nature's Way in 1990. I was really troubled by what was going on, and nobody seemed to have any real clear ideas of what to do. So I thought, well, we got a couple of high cards that we could try and play. So started checking with some of the other companies in Utah Valley, and we're honoring them today. It's hard to believe that we're here, and when we were sitting together and talking about all of this, is we had no idea where this would evolve and how it would go. And we figured we'd talk about it for a few months and we all go home and conclude, can't do anything. Fortunately, it went the other way, is that I would see the resolve of that group was far greater, and these were intense competitors. And yet, within that, this was a moment when we set aside our differences to a higher purpose that we could articulate. It was us against the FDA. And that made it really super clear. So this is the kind of ephemeral literature that we saw during DSHEA. we adopted the dinosaur as one of our logos and our mottos is let's not go the way of the dinosaurs. We had, this is fairly direct. I think you get the message. But that was the attitude. And they're very open about it. And then there's the famous Mel Gibson video, which I'm guessing most of you have seen. And we can thank Sandy and Harry for producing that video with a producer colleague of theirs. And if I'm not mistaken, Sandy, that was filmed in your house. Or was it your neighbor's house? Okay. Got it. And but it was Sandy and Harry that produced that Mel Gibson video, which was, if you haven't seen it, all you have to do is put Mel Gibson vitamins, punch it in, and it pops straight up. And it was never aired publicly. And we debated whether we should or shouldn't. And we could see signs of success possibly with DSHEA. And as I remember, there was some discussion, this might inflame a couple of our opponents to the point that they might back off. Anyway, so when the first bill was introduced, DSHEA as we know it was the last step of a much longer process. The first bill that was introduced in June of 1992 was the Health Freedom Act, a very intentional title to that bill. We really wanted to make this point. This is about health freedom. The opponents to this bill, of which there were many, said, we're not having that. So we kept negotiating titles to the bill, and then we'll get to DSHEA at the end, and what I think is the important word in that acronym. So this is the actual bill as it passed in October of 1994, and you have to just stop and think what we were up against is we had virtually the entire organized medical, pharmaceutical, government agencies, nonprofits, big and small, in opposition to this bill. The reason it passed was because of this extraordinary uprising, one more time, of the public in a populist movement, because this is a country with a culture of populist spirit. And what makes DSHEA unique in the world is that sense of populism, I can't find it in any other country in the world. And if you look at how our products, dietary supplements, are regulated elsewhere, it was always top down. It was bureaucrats, it was governments, it was committees that were kind of trying to figure this thing out. DSHEA was very much grassroots up. And in a rare example of the people in the industry building and creating something as a vision, and then essentially battling it out with the bureaucrats and the politicians and everybody else, and we won. So my question going forward, I don't want to forget this. Henry Waxman, he might be a familiar name to some. Henry Waxman was the second most powerful member of the House of Representatives during the DSHEA period. He was the chair of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health. Everything having to do with DSHEA had to go through him. An intense critic of DSHEA, and said on more than one occasion publicly, it will never pass on my watch. He wrote a book about his experiences in Congress, and he has a little chapter on DSHEA. He could not let it go. And let me read this. As a lesson in politics, DSHEA is instructive because it shows how industry can concoct an issue based entirely on misinformation, my favorite word, that ultimately allows it to circumvent the law. In time, bad laws always reveal themselves. And one enduring truth about Washington is that no issue is ever settled for good. I underscore that last sentence. And he's just saying what comes around goes around, and this is unfinished business. We have a whole lot of folks, and I just want to give you a sense of who they are. These are organizations that opposed DSHEA in 92 to 94. And I'll let you read these. These are not small and unfamiliar organizations. AARP, American Cancer Society, American Nurses Association, Public Health, CSPI, our old friends, Consumers Union, Consumer Federation of America, National Consumers League, National Association of Attorneys General. This is who we were dealing with. Yeah. And they were co-signing big letters, all adding their titles of organizations opposing DSHEA. And despite that, the public won. Oh, we're not done. There were others, but this is just to give you a menu of what was going on. And yeah, it was super intense. You can put it that way. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the present day ancestry that lives very much. Dr. John Christopher was one of the great herbalists of the last century. He had a school in Springville, Utah, just down the road, called the School of Natural Healing. This is his book that was published, and it became a Bible, if you will. What he did was in the classic spirit of populism and the commons. He published all of his formulas, and none of them were proprietary. And he wanted the public to have them. Who does that sound like? That's Samuel Thompson. He was a Thompsonian. This is for the people. And Nature's Way and Nature's Herbs and Nature's Sunshine are all companies that grew and prospered around Dr. Christopher's formulas and his teachings. That's how important he was and how important his formulas and his message was in building the modern American herbal tradition, which is deeply grounded in this tradition that is almost 200 years old. And little do we know. But what got us to this point today is the very same working principles as before. Is once we can set aside our differences as we're working on various issues that we've talked about, is set that apart and then ask ourselves the fundamental question is this fight over or not? I think Henry Waxman's right. It's not over. And we have seen the new way this is going to play out. I'll come back to that one. I'll do it right now. Many of you know Joey Savage, great young man. He was at the DSHEA Summit. It was led by Nutri-Ingredients and UNPA. And he was really inspired. And he did an interview with some of the Nutri-Ingredients team. And I just love this quote. "I've recently felt a motivation to become involved. I want to be boots on the ground, representing my age demographic and being part of that new wave of DSHEA that comes forward." Hallelujah. That's the spirit we need to see in here. And Joey's going to be a leader in that effort. So, the story of DSHEA is really both modern and ancient. The clarity of our message and to our consumers will depend really on us understanding our own history and where our strength comes from and how we need to communicate to an audience, but in a very different way. What we did during the DSHEA period would not work again, in my judgment. That technology has now shifted how people understand and learn information, and we're going to have to get really good at that. And one of our big problems, we talked about this yesterday, is rather than the FDA is not the enemy, in my judgment. If you have to really decide who is your true opposition, it's not them. It really is the AMA, based on the history of what they have done, they continue to do. What they did a couple of years ago in California with AB 2098, which was to gag physicians in their own offices, if they said anything outside the orthodoxy of vaccine policy, they could lose their license. Fortunately, that bill died. There was so much opposition to it. But what it was an exceptional grab to take that license and hold it as a noose around the neck of California doctors to say, if you step out of line, and they were going to send undercover agents to go in and try and get doctors to say, well, there are options, and boom. That's all it would take. And as we talked about yesterday, YouTube is now the arbiter of what's true, as is Facebook, as is other social organizations. They have more power, I think, than the traditional national press, because we communicate so much through that medium of social media. Is if they're now the arbiter of what's true and what is not, and you can just plug Morris Fishbein's name into how that policy can be read and developed, is we don't like your message, it contradicts our own belief, we control the medium, so you don't get to say what you think is true. See, that is the message that I think we have to really look at. That is our real opponent, that is our real mission. So I will use mandatory product listing as one question. HSA, FSA that Peter talked about the other day. There's a whole bunch of issues that we're interested in and we're working on. The issue that I think that we should really be zeroing in like a dog on a pork chop is this question of misinformation. Who is using that term to define us as misinformers? Because that word is now taking on a term of art that will be used as a way to automatically tick us out so that social media can, within seconds, simply say unacceptable and gone. So I do believe this is the new form of censorship, and it's a very powerful form. And it's happening so quickly that I feel we're getting distracted. And if we had one single issue to unite around, where we have a lot of other things to discuss and try and make our minds up, I find it hard to think that we should not be able to agree on this one, and that our singular efforts right now should be devoted to protecting the rights of our consumers to receive information of their choice, for us to be able to communicate what we believe to be true, and that there should be no medium separating us from that consumer, from that interested party, which takes us back 1,000 years, because that's the way it has traditionally been, is to separate the knowledge from the people. We saw that in the monasteries. We have seen that in how the Flexner Report tried to do it over and over again. The effort was to separate knowledge, information, access to health, and the products that we need from the people. And somebody would be the arbiter of who gets what. We need to be the arbiter of that, not YouTube. And so the message is that we have to think of DSHEA not with the lens of a 30-year anniversary recognition, which is entirely appropriate and which we will do, but to look at it as a 1,000-year history that is repeated over and over again and has taught us the same message again and again. And if we don't understand that and we're missing the signal, by the time that we realize what's going on, we will be the frog in the pot. And we'll be medium rare at that point. And let's not get there. So this is where I need you to really think about it, and I welcome your sense of, is this the message? How can it be communicated better? What do you agree, disagree with? And if so, how do we begin to organize around a unifying principle? This industry needs a unifying principle. We always shine when we can find that. And as I say, I believe this is it. And it's urgent. It's happening so quickly that we almost don't see it happening. So with that, this is such a wonderful industry full of great people, and our consumers look to us for the information, the products, and the services. We got to protect our practitioners. They're really in a vulnerable place because if they step out of line, then they do get in trouble. And just as a point, is there used to be natural healers in all 50 states. Today, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there are 16 states that allow licensure of naturopaths. So what happened to the 34 others that used to have practicing naturopaths and others. And talking to our naturopathic friends, their feeling is it would be very hard to get these other states to grant licensure. And some are thinking, do we actually want it? That license is the noose to jerk our chain, to stay in line. So I think we have a wide swath. We have the economic power. We have the political relationships, which need rebuilding, but we have them. I think everyone is going to be looking to us, our consumers, our professional community, and I think even overseas, there are clear signs of the United States is the beacon on the hill here. And we're going to have to lead the way in I think, a fresh effort to establish and protect our rights of speech, our rights to communicate. And I'm in for it. I hope you are too. This will be our next great journey. And if we do it right, it will be one of the greatest things that we will have done for this present and future generations. Thank you very much. Whew.